Let me give you some background. I've been working at this tech startup for about a year. The job was great, but the commute, not so much. My apartment was on the opposite side of the city, which meant I had to take the subway every day. Now, if you've ever been on a subway during rush hour, you know it's not exactly a picnic. It's more like being stuffed into a sardine can with a bunch of strangers who are just as grumpy as you are. Anyway, this one day started like any other. I woke up, got ready, and headed to the subway station. The first train was packed, so I decided to wait for the next one. Big mistake. As the second train pulled up, I noticed there was a bit of space left. Perfect, I thought. I could finally get home and relax. But just as I was about to step in, this woman with a double stroller came out of nowhere, running like she was in some kind of twisted marathon. Before I could even blink, she shoved past me, pushing me away from the door. I stumbled, barely keeping my balance. I shouted at her, telling her that I also wanted to get home. I tried to hold the door open, but she wasn't having it. She yelled back that she and her kids wanted to go home too. I told her there was no reason to push me out of the doorway. Just then, the train driver's voice crackled over the intercom asking us not to block the doors. I managed to squeeze in thinking the ordeal was over, but the woman angrily told me she didn't want me to take the subway. She shoved me again harder this time. I lost my footing and fell backwards, right out of the train. As I hit the platform, I heard the doors close and the train start to move. The woman, who I'd later dubbed Karen in my mind, made some ridiculous gestures and flipped me off through the window as the train rolled away. I slowly got to my feet, feeling a bit dizzy. That's when I noticed a warm trickle on my forehead. Great, I was bleeding. To make matters worse, my phone had fallen out of my pocket during the fall. The screen was completely shattered. So much for calling the police. When I stood there, feeling sorry for myself, an older lady approached me. She had a kind face and looked genuinely concerned. She asked if I was okay and if I needed an ambulance. I told her I was fine and thanked her, explaining it was just a small wound. It was just a small wound, but her concern was touching. Before I could say anything else, a security guard walked up, his radio crackling. The radio confirmed they had spotted the woman with the twin buggy in the last cart. The security guard instructed me to take the next train to the following station and visit the security office there. I thanked the old lady and the security guard, feeling a bit better about the whole situation. Maybe karma was real after all. 20 minutes later, I found myself sitting in the security office, right next to Karen. She looked less than pleased to see me. A different security guard was taking my statement and documenting everything. He asked me to tell him exactly what happened. I recounted the whole story, watching Karen's face get redder and redder with each detail. The security guard took photos of my broken phone and examined my now-dried wound. Then he did something that made my day. He showed us the CCTV footage from inside the train and the station. There it was, in crystal clear detail. Karen pushing me falling, everything. It was like watching a really unfunny slapstick comedy, except I was the one getting slapped. The security guard said this was clear evidence and that they would be reporting the incident to the police. Karen tried to protest, mentioning her kids, but the security guard cut her off. He explained that her actions had endangered another passenger, which was a serious offense. As if that wasn't enough, the security guard dropped another bombshell. He told Karen that she had been traveling without a valid ticket, which would cost her an additional 60 euros. Eventually, Karen had to pay for my new phone. The police also issued a restraining order. She wasn't allowed to come within 5 meters of me. Every time I saw her after that, she'd glare at me like I was the scum of the earth. But hey, at least she used a different train car. The old lady and I actually became friends after that. Turns out she lives near my new place. Yeah, I moved closer to work after all this. She bakes the most amazing cakes you've ever tasted. So I guess something good came out of this whole mess after all. And last I heard, Karen got caught trying to sneak onto the subway without a ticket again. This time they banned her from using public transport for a month. Karma, right? I'm an 18-year-old Asian girl, though most people think I'm much younger. I'm only 5 feet tall, which doesn't help with the whole look in my age thing. I've had some rough experiences in the past, including abusive relationships, so I tend to get scared easily and avoid confrontation. To help with my anxiety, I usually carry around a plushie of Spider-Man or Groot. They were gifts from my baby cousin, who's also my godson, and they have a strong emotional connection for me. Unfortunately, on this specific day, I'd forgotten to bring them. So there I was, sitting on the bus after a pretty tough day at college. We'd just finished an assessment on a play about domestic violence, which had left me feeling a bit shaken. All I wanted to do was read my book in peace. I took my usual spot towards the back of the bus, where it's well ventilated. There was a guy next to me, jamming out to Eminem with his headphones on. I settled in, hoping for a quiet ride home. That's when 3 people boarded the bus and sat behind me. There was a young boy, maybe around 10 years old, a teenage boy who looked about 16 or 17, and an older woman who I assumed was their grandmother. The younger boy tapped me on the shoulder. He politely asked for my attention, addressing me as Miss. I responded kindly, asking if I could help him with something and calling him Little Man. The boy complimented my keys, asking where I got them. I thanked him and explained that they were a gift from a friend at a Comic-Con a few years ago. The teenage boy overheard our conversation and scoffed. He made a rude comment, implying that I was a nerd loser and suggesting that only ugly girls were nerds because they couldn't get boyfriends. He then contradicted himself by saying I was too pretty to be a nerd. I was taken aback by his comment but tried to keep my cool. I told him that it wasn't his business, but I was indeed a fan of animated books and shows. I mentioned that my mother is Japanese and that I love Japanese manga. That's when all hell broke loose. The grandmother, who I'll call Karen from now on, started yelling at the top of her lungs. She berated me for speaking about my culture in front of her grandchildren, using offensive slurs and accusing me of trying to influence them negatively. I flinched at her volume, my legs starting to shake slightly. I tried to apologize and express my confusion, but Karen cut me off. She continued her tirade, insulting my culture and my generation with more slurs and accusations. At this point, I was tearing up and shaking even more. The other passengers had turned to watch the scene unfold. The young boy attempted to intervene, pleading with his grandmother to leave me alone. However, the teenage boy interrupted, telling his brother to shut up. He made a disgusting comment about me deserving the treatment and suggested I go home with him, adding more inappropriate remarks. His comment made me feel sick. I wished I could come up with a witty response, but all I could manage was a shaky plea for them to leave me alone. This seemed to enrage Karen even more. She screamed at me, calling me disrespectful and using more insults. She then demanded that the bus driver throw me off the bus using another slur. We'd stopped at a bus stop in front of the local hospital. Karen grabbed my hair and started dragging me to the front of the bus. I was screaming in fear, my anxiety attack getting worse by the second. The guy who had been listening to music finally noticed what was happening and rushed over. He yelled at Karen, demanding to know how she dared to treat me like that. His yelling, though well-intentioned, only made my shaking worse. I burst out sobbing, covering my ears and shutting my eyes tightly. The bus driver got out of his booth and knelt beside me. I was so overwhelmed that I started to black out. I vaguely felt something kick my leg, which I later learned was the teenage boy. Karen continued yelling, ordering me to get up and listen to my elders. The young boy pleaded with his grandmother again, pointing out that I was scared and suggesting they should go home. Karen refused, insisting that I needed to be kicked off the bus and taught a lesson. The bus driver intervened, telling Karen she had to leave the bus and informing her that she would be permanently banned from this bus company and other local companies. Karen protested loudly, claiming it was her only way to and from town. The music guy made a witty comment, telling Karen she should have thought about the consequences before assaulting me. Karen demanded that the driver kick him off too, but the driver stood firm. He told Karen that he would be calling the police and pressing charges if I didn't. The driver locked the bus doors to keep Karen there until the police arrived. A kind woman, who turned out to be Karen's daughter and the mother of the two boys, came over to check on me. She asked if I was all right and apologized for her mother's behavior. The young boy hugged me, sobbing and apologizing. I was still shaky but managed to hug him back. Karen and the teenage boy were arrested. I gave my statement to the police and the bus driver pressed charges on my behalf. He also told me that everything was captured on the bus's CCTV cameras. I later found out that Karen's daughter is married to a Japanese man. Talk about hypocrisy. I'm home now, safe and sound. My aunt picked me up and drove me home. I'm still recovering from the incident, but I'm grateful for the kind people who stood up for me that day. I met my ex-wife back in college. She was this vibrant, outgoing girl who always seemed to be the center of attention. I was more of a quiet, studious type, but somehow we clicked. Looking back, I think I was just flattered that someone so popular would be interested in me. We dated for a few years, got married right after graduation, and settled into our careers. At first, things were great. We had a nice house, good jobs, and a comfortable life. But as time went on, I started to notice some red flags. My wife always had to have things her way. If we disagreed on something, she'd throw a fit until I gave in. She'd make big purchases without consulting me, then act like I was the unreasonable one when I got upset. And don't even get me started on how she treated waitstaff and retail workers. I tried to make it work though. I thought maybe if I just loved her enough, she'd change. But after 20 years of marriage, I was exhausted. Still, I wanted to do something special for our anniversary. I made reservations at this fancy restaurant downtown, thinking maybe a nice evening out would help us reconnect. We'd just ordered our appetizers when she dropped the bomb. She told me she wanted a divorce. I was shocked and asked if she was really doing this here and now. She confirmed, saying she was tired of pretending everything was okay. When I suggested we could have waited until we got home, she said she wanted to do it somewhere public, so I wouldn't make a scene. I was stunned. People at nearby tables were starting to stare. I could feel my face turning red with embarrassment and anger. I told her fine, if that's what she wanted, we'd get a divorce. I paid for the meal we hadn't even eaten and drove us home in silence. Later, I found out she'd been having an affair with a co-worker. Typical. I tried to make the divorce process as smooth as possible. I made a list of all our belongings and asked her to mark what she wanted. I thought we could be adults about this, but no, she had to turn it into a circus. Her demands got crazier by the day. She wanted the house, the car, my retirement savings, you name it. The lawyer fees were piling up, and I was just so tired of fighting. In the end, I gave her almost everything she asked for just to be done with it. About a year and a half later, the divorce was finally over. I'd met someone new, a kind, understanding woman who actually treated me with respect. We got married not long after my divorce was finalized. Then one day, out of the blue, my ex-wife shows up at our door, crying her eyes out. She told us that the man she left me for had dumped her. My new wife and I tried to be nice. We let her in, made her some tea, and listened to her sob story. I was polite, but inside I was seething. The audacity of this woman. She started calling us regularly after that, even dropping by unannounced. During one of these calls, she asked to borrow money. That's when I remembered the funeral plots I'd bought when we were married. I suggested that instead of lending her money, I could buy her funeral plot from her. She agreed but demanded $20,000 for it. I was shocked at the ridiculous price, but she insisted it was take it or leave it. I was furious. I'd had enough of her games. But then fate handed me the perfect opportunity for revenge. My ex-wife's stepfather passed away unexpectedly. She hated the guy and refused to have anything to do with him, but I'd always liked him. I went to the funeral and got talking to some family members. They mentioned they were struggling to afford the burial. That's when I had my brilliant idea. I donated my funeral plot, the one right next to my ex-wife's, for her stepfather's burial. My ex didn't bother coming to the funeral, so she has no idea. Now I'm just waiting. One day, she'll find out that the man she despised is going to be her eternal neighbor. And let me tell you, the thought of her reaction puts a big grin on my face every time. I know it might seem petty, but after years of putting up with her drama and entitlement, it feels good to finally have the last laugh. And maybe spending eternity next to her stepfather will teach her a thing or two about kindness. But I'm not holding my breath. I grew up on a small farm, a place my parents poured their hearts and savings into back in the early 70s. They'd always dreamed of owning land, of building a life away from the hustle and bustle of the city. When they found those 6 acres, it was like striking gold. I was just a toddler when they moved us out there. Mom and Dad worked tirelessly, transforming the overgrown fields into our home. They built our house with their own hands, planning to add a small barn once they caught their breath. Life was simple, but we were happy. That fall, everything changed. I remember it like it was yesterday, even though I was barely old enough to form lasting memories. It was a crisp autumn day, leaves crunching under my feet as I played in the yard. Mom was hanging laundry, keeping an eye on me as I toddled around. Suddenly, the peace was shattered by the roar of engines. I looked up to see a group of people on snowmobiles tearing through our property, guns strapped to their backs. They zoomed right past me, so close I could feel the wind from their machines. Mom yelled at them to get away from her child. She screamed, scooping me up and running towards the house. I'd never seen her so scared. She shouted to Dad about the armed intruders who had almost run over their baby. Dad came bursting out of the house and he demanded to know what was going on. The snowmobilers circled back, cutting their engines as they approached us. There were 5 of them, all decked out in hunting gear. One of them asked what the problem was, stating they were just passing through. Dad angrily pointed out that this was private property and they had almost hit his kid. Another snowmobiler told Dad to relax, claiming they'd been using this route for years and it wasn't a big deal. Dad insisted it was indeed a big deal, explaining that this wasn't farmland anymore but their home and they couldn't just drive through with guns. A third snowmobiler dismissed Dad's concerns, saying they weren't changing their route and would be back tomorrow, telling us to stay out of the way if we didn't like it. With that, they fired up their engines and sped off, leaving us stunned in their wake. Dad was fuming, pacing back and forth on the porch, yelling about how they thought they could do whatever they wanted and that he'd show them. For the next few days, it was the same story. The hunters would come tearing through our property, ignoring our protests. Each time, Dad would confront them, and each time, they'd brush him off. I could see the frustration building in him, his jaw clenching tighter with every encounter. Then, one evening, I saw a glint in his eye. He had a plan. Dad remarked that if they wanted to act like animals, we'd treat them like animals. The next day, Dad fired up the old backhoe. He spent hours digging a deep, narrow trench along the edge of our property where the snowmobilers usually entered. It was impressive work, stretching for a good distance, but he wasn't done yet. He gathered up every bit of dog poop from our 4 large dogs, stuff that had been festering all summer long in a pile at the far end of our land. It was ripe, to say the least. Dad hauled it all to the trench and filled it up. He chuckled, saying he couldn't wait to see how they'd like this little surprise. He covered the trench with dead leaves and waited for the first snow to dust over it. You'd never know it was there unless you were looking for it. The next morning we were ready. Dad stood on the porch, coffee in one hand and his rifle in the other. We didn't have to wait long. The familiar roar of engines filled the air as the snowmobilers came barreling onto our property. They were moving fast, clearly not expecting any obstacles. Then, in a moment I'll never forget, the lead snowmobile hit the trench. The machine went vertical, its rider flying forward. The others, following too close behind, slammed into the first one. In seconds, all 5 snowmobiles were stuck, their riders sprawled in the muck. The snowmobilers started shouting in confusion and disgust, realizing they had landed in dog excrement. Dad just stood there sipping his coffee, watching as they struggled to free themselves. The smell was overwhelming, even from where we stood. The hunters were covered head to toe in rotten dog poop, gagging and cursing. Dad calmly asked if they were having trouble and needed help. One of the snowmobilers angrily called Dad a crazy bastard and said he couldn't do this. Dad coolly replied that he was simply digging on his own property, suggesting they should have listened when he told them to find another route. It took them hours to winch their snowmobiles out of the trench. By the time they were done, they were filthy, stinking, and thoroughly humiliated. One of them shouted that this wasn't over and they'd be back. Dad calmly advised against it, warning that they'd have to explain to the police why they were trespassing on private property with firearms if they returned. They left, trailing the stench of defeat behind them. We never saw them on our land again. I'm really proud of how my dad didn't resort to violence and how he sure taught those entitled hunters a lesson they'd never forget. And I learned early on that sometimes you have to get a little dirty to keep what's yours safe. And that, my friends, is the story of how my dad outsmarted a bunch of entitled hunters with nothing more than a backhoe and a pile of dog poop.